Hi, I'm Alasia Nuti. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. Today, I will talk about disruptive and violent protest, and in particular, whether members of press groups have the right to resort to uncivil means to pursue political change. My talk draws heavily on an article that I recently published with Gabriele Batano, my colleague at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. The title of the paper, which has been recently published in the Journal of Politics, is Must the Subaltern Speak Publicly, Public Reason, Liberalism, and the Ethics of Fighting Severe Injustice. You may well all remember the protest after the murder of George Floyd, an African American man who was assassinated while in police custody in Minneapolis. Floyd's death sparked protests across the US and worldwide, calling for Floyd's murderer to be held accountable and demanding action against police brutality and other issues of racial injustice. Although the Black Lives Matter protest following Floyd's murder were largely peaceful, there were still some episodes of disruption and violence. For example, protesters in Minneapolis set the third police precinct on fire, doing riots which also led to looting and destruction of private property, inflicting several $100 million worth of damage. Now, in the case of the protests following Floyd's murder, commentators were largely sympathetic with the motives of the protesters. However, many commentators also pointed out that violence and disruption should have no place in protesting. For example, Joe Biden sided with the protesters, but at the same time he stressed that violence overshadows any legitimate reasons for protesting. So basically, every time a disruptive and violent protest takes place, commentators are quite quick at invoking the value of civility and the value of civil behavior to pursue political change. And that invocation has often the role of discrediting the disruptive and violent protest in the first place. Now, you may actually think that this type of commentators have a point. Why should we actually praise disruption, coercion, uncivility, violence in protesting? Surely we should cherish much more civility in pursuing political change. Well, the problem is very often over history, it's through the use of violent and disruptive means, from sabotage to direct action, to the destruction of property and even violence towards people itself, that oppressed group managed to get hurt by political authorities and the wider public. As Fred Hampton, the leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther, who was assassinated in 1869, argued, to put down the gun, it's necessary to pick up the gun. Basically, when you are oppressed in a society that keeps committing violence towards you, the only way to get heard is very often to engage in violent and disruptive behavior yourself. But you might think that whether or not disruption and violence are likely to bring about positive change is actually irrelevant. When a society systematically fails a social group, members of that social group have every right to be angry and confrontational. Basically, the wider society cannot demand any appropriate behavior from members of oppressed groups. This is the fault of another leader of the Black Panthers, Eldridge Cleaver, who in his famous credo for rioters and looters argue that in the council of the oppressed, the oppressor has no vote, making what looks like an intrinsic argument for why members of oppressed group have actually a right to resort to violence and uncivil means, no matter what the payoff of their use might be. We live at a time where liberalism is said to be in crisis, and it's also criticized for being unable to guide us to address our contemporary challenges. One problem with liberalism is its stress on the importance of respect and civility. A value like civility might be cherished, and we might think that it is indeed important to regulate behavior in society. The problem is, however, that we don't live in ideal societies. In our unjust societies, this emphasis on the importance of civility turns out to silence those who are oppressed, confining them to the use of only certain means to pursue political change, sometimes means that might not be effective at all. Recently, also the views of the liberal egalitarian philosopher John Rawls have received much criticism. And we might think that Rawls cannot be saved from the criticism that the liberal stress on civility becomes complicit with injustice in our non-ideal circumstances. This is because of Rawls' notions of public reason. According to Rawls, public officials and ordinary citizens must make decisions about issues of basic justice and constitutional essentials through the exchange of mutually acceptable arguments, not by resorting to disruptive or violent means. This is indeed described by Rawls as a duty of civility. Now, the duty to exchange public reason, the duty of civility, is linked to another central notion in Rawls' theory of political liberalism, that of reasonableness. Now, reasonableness is the centerpiece of what a democratic citizen should look like, according to Rawls. A reasonable citizen is a citizen who has the desire that society should be governed by fair terms of cooperation among all persons, treated as free and equal. Now, what I'm going to argue is that actually this criticism of Rawls is misguided completely. And this is because public reason does not apply to those suffering from severe injustice. Now, Rawls stresses that his political liberalism and the duty to follow public reason is not meant to be an ethics for saints. The duty of civility, so the duty to offer public reason, is conditional on reciprocity. It is only when we can be assured that others will follow public reason that we have the duty ourselves. In Rawls' own words, if we cannot rely on others following public reason, then it might be irrational or self-sacrificial for us to follow public reason. It can see that as supererogatory, not something that we can ask people to normally do. Now, in what sense it will be sacrificial for me to follow the duty of civility when others are not willing to do the same? Now, this is because it will be too costly for me to do so. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I will experience a material disadvantage by trying to spread society's resources while others are actually working hard to keep those resources for themselves. But if you're suffering from oppression, by following public reason where others are not willing to do the same, you might also have diminished chances of redressing injustice, the injustice you suffer from, because you will give up on effective means to bring about change, the uncivil means, disruptive, coercive, violent means, just in order to follow public reason. And you may also have a reduced ability to affirm your agency in the face of the oppression you experience by becoming angry and confrontational when you have every right to do so. Now, so what citizens should do? How should citizens understand whether they must follow the duty of civility and reject violent and disruptive means in pursuing a progressive change? Well, what I want to suggest is that what citizens should do is to ask themselves whether the society they live in is reasonably just towards the social groups they belong to. Now, according to Rawls, a society is reasonably just when it provides basic rights and opportunities to all its citizens, and it gives special priority for such rights and opportunities. Finally, a society can be regarded as reasonably just when it provides adequate all-purpose means for citizens to make an effective use of those rights and opportunities. But this actually means that in society, differently positioned persons will have different duties when it comes to public reason and civility. Those towards whom a society is not reasonably just, they will be relieved of the duty to provide public reason, the duty of civility, and will be allowed to resort to coercion, violence, and disruption in their political advocacy and their attempts to bring about progressive change. So, for example, in the US context, you may well think that African Americans should be relieved of the duty of public reason, and this is because African Americans are, for example, denied basic rights of security due to widespread institutional racism. However, in societies, there might be members towards whom a society is reasonably just. And those members of a society towards whom a society is reasonably just will still have to stick to public reason and civility. Now, this is actually a way to reconcile the need to resort to uncivil, disruptive, coercive means on the part of oppressed groups in society, and what is actually the value of civility. I also think that to complicate things a little bit, we can actually carve out an exception for some members of oppressed groups. This is when groups suffering from severe injustice authorize some privileged allies to join their disruptive and violent actions out of solidarity. Now, does this mean that for the oppressed anything goes? I think that that's not the case. There is at least an important side constraint regulating the use of disruption and violence on the part of those suffering from severe injustice. This is a side constraint that actually can be derived directly from Rawls' own key notion of reasonableness. I call this side constraint the non-compounding of severe injustice condition. Now, compounding the severe injustice that another group in society is suffering from to make some political gains for one's own oppressed group is actually incompatible with the desire for a society regulated by fair terms of cooperation that any reasonable people, whether or not they suffer from severe injustice, should have. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So take the case of Torre Maura, a suburb in Rome, which is really impoverished and has been abandoned by the Italian state and local authorities for years. A few years ago, protests occurred when social housing was given to members of the Roma community. So local protesters were very much against the fact that members of the Roma community, another very oppressed group in the Italian society, received social housing. The residents of Torre Maura engaged in coercive and violent protest. These protests included stopping Roma persons to enter their allocated flats and destroying food made for them. Now, it doesn't really matter whether the residents of Torre Maura can be said to suffer from severe injustice, even according to rules on understanding of when a society can be said to be reasonably just. We cannot say that they are. The problem here is that in protesting, they were not only resorting to coercive and violent means, something that they will be allowed to do according to my reconstruction of when the duty of public reason and duty of civility apply. The problem is that they were doing so by compounding the severe injustice that another group in the Italian society, namely the Roma community, was experiencing. And this is absolutely incompatible with reasonableness and with the reasonable desire for a society regulated by fair systems of cooperation between free and equal citizens. Now, it really looks like Rawls' political philosophy is not completely useless to guide our action in unjust society. Actually, it turns out to offer some sophisticated understanding, a kind of compass to think about our differentiated obligation when it comes to the means to pursue political change. So if I have persuaded you about the importance and the significance of Rawls for our challenging times, you should definitely go to a bookshop and order a copy of the book that I wrote with Gabriele Badano, which is just out with Oxford University Press. The book is called Politicizing Political Liberalism and on the Containment of Illiberal and Democratic Views. And in the book, we further show that Rawls has still a lot to say about how we should behave in our unjust and, in many cases, illiberal societies.